So Nintendo has announced a new game, not a Switch or Switch 2 game, but a mobile app called Pictonico. Now, this is due to release on the 28th of May, which of course fits nicely into the middle of that 5 week gap between the release of Yoshi and the Mysterious Book and Star Fox. I'd noted before that it was slightly unusual that there was 5 weeks between those two games and yet only three between Star Fox and Splatoon Raiders. And it does seem that this is actually going to be a relatively big deal for Nintendo, despite being in the mobile space. And you can see why they've put this in the mobile space. They've got obviously previous interests in titles like WarioWare and Face Raiders, but this takes that kind of technology, those kinds of ideas, and provides an innovative twist. Now, the credits show that it's co-developed by Intelligent Systems, and so seemingly by the WarioWare team, and this does make a lot of sense. WarioWare has had two games on Switch previously, and while neither had absolute breakout sales, given that they were probably fairly cheap to develop, they've obviously been a fairly profitable source of revenue for Nintendo, but it might not be such a priority to continue pushing WarioWare as a brand right now. However, there are different ways to make these kinds of minigame-led concepts a success, and of course they have the IP-led approach using the Wario character, but they don't seem to have really pushed that quite so much. It's true that you can favourite WarioWare on the Nintendo Today app, and of course that has come in handy in terms of the way that they can promote the Pictonico app to people over Nintendo Today in future, and they've also got quite a big focus on WarioWare in the Japanese Nintendo sites compared to in the West, but I still think that fundamentally Wario could be quite a limited character for them. Yes, this would link beautifully to future Mario movies, and this might be their thought process, but this kind of gameplay could theoretically exist without Wario, and that seems to be what they're going with here. So of course, I don't think this is the end of the WarioWare brand, and it will depend a lot on how this title is received, but what's interesting to me is that it's not a tiny little game, but is actually fairly full-fledged. There are 80 mini-games here, and yes, they're all basically smaller titles adapting and playing around with pictures, but it's still a significant amount of effort to put into a mobile title, and the positioning in the schedule suggests to me that it's something that they do see as having, hopefully, a fairly big future. Of course, it could have been a Switch 2 game in theory, and in the past, if you think back to the DS and 3DS era, then these kinds of titles were very much on the handheld systems. But I think they now realise that mobile phones and smart devices have dominance in this kind of space, and they'd only be inviting copycats off the hardware if they were to gatekeep this behind the Switch devices, especially since the Switch devices are relatively expensive. It does also allow people to interact with Nintendo in a way that means that even if they don't have the actual high-priced consoles, they can still enjoy Nintendo-type content. Now, this does mean that the Switch and Switch 2 are losing some of the distinctiveness of the DS and 3DS, but part of that is just an inevitable consequence of the fact that the DS was a precursor to the iPhone era and released in a time when that kind of experimentation could succeed. But at this point, it's probably inevitable that the Switch and Switch 2 will be focused more primarily on the core console gaming, and the smartphone games will be used for more experimental concepts, although I still think there will be a number of more experimental games on the core devices, as we've seen in the past with titles like Labo and Ring Fit Adventure. Now, I think the way to look at games like this is Nintendo making lots and lots of small bets. Most of these will inevitably fizzle out and be forgotten, but if you put enough bets down, there's the chance that one will do massive outsized numbers, and frankly, this game does feel like it has that potential. Particularly in the Japanese market, you can see how it would appeal. I'm not entirely sure if the name would be quite as successful in the Western market, but certainly the concept of playing around with your photos seems like it's got a great deal of potential, and of course it seems to have the same kind of fun and interactivity that we've associated with Nintendo over the years. It's an interesting evolution for Intelligent Systems as well, and of course Intelligent Systems is absolutely huge in Japan because of Fire Emblem Heroes, which is a mobile app, and the Fire Emblem Heroes app seems to be bigger in many respects than the Fire Emblem console games have been over the years. And so there is a potential here for Intelligent Systems to continue to develop this aspect of their business. I almost wonder whether titles like Paper Mario could even be reconstituted in a way that would suit mobile, given their emphasis on simplicity of play. Perhaps some kind of cross between Pokemon Go and Paper Mario, although I don't necessarily think this is especially likely. At any rate, it's an interesting thing when Nintendo drops something a little bit left field, and I'm glad to see that they are still doing it. It also, I think, shows that their development effort is truly diversified at this point. It's not necessarily the case that we can predict whether their new announcements will focus on theme park initiatives, merchandising, mobile, or console gamings, or something else completely beside. And I think that is deliberate. They are continuing to try to expand on all fronts in order to become a bit more resilient to the vagaries of the console scene, where inevitably the ups and downs of various things, not just in recent times, memory prices and economic conditions, but also just things like tastes and trends, can have an outsized impact on their future. If Nintendo is going to be secure for the long term, then they do need to be able to have different options that they're bringing to market, and this could be something that they have as a long-term consideration in terms of breaking into the mobile space, even though they did appear to retrench in the mid-2010s. I think in many respects you can see that there were a lot of things they threw at the wall during the 2010s that they did see as having some long-term potential, but which they kind of left on ice for a little bit during the early 2020s as they realized that the Switch was a success and that they could develop those core concepts. But if you think about the things that they did during that time, initiatives like Mario Maker and Splatoon and Miitomo all had some considerable success, as well as, of course, the aforementioned Fire Emblem Heroes. So I think it's natural now that Nintendo is able to expand their reach and is now presumably in the situation of having major teams developing all of their core games concurrently, that they can choose to take a slightly broader perspective and put their bets on a few more obscure concepts. It also seems possible to me that there will be a few more of these kinds of things at this point, because of course this would probably have been in the planning during 2024 and early 2025, a period where they were obviously going to be hoping that the Switch 2 was a success, but it would always behoove them to have some kind of backup plan, and I think we can see with the Switch transition from 3DS and Wii U that although they had basically written off the Wii U, which did not have an original game after the launch of the Switch when Breath of the Wild launched on the Wii U, they did have a considerable level of support for the 3DS even for over 2 years after the Switch released. And I think in the same way now, although they still have the original Nintendo Switch, they also want to have a breadth of different backup plans, including Nintendo Switch Online, which provides a lovely regular revenue stream, things like Nintendo Music, which have been drawing people towards that, and of course expanding their mobile infrastructure. At any rate, this is just a quick reaction video. I think I will be quite interested to see how this title works out when it's released. Let me know what you think, and if you are interested, please do consider checking out the Patreon, where there is early, ad-free and exclusive content, as it really does help out the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.